My name is Raul Katz. I'm a researcher at the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation. I'm also president of Telecom Advisory Services, a consulting firm that does primarily economic impact studies of new technologies. And I've been doing this for quite a while, having done work in the United States and overseas for right now over 40 some years. The US economy grew at an average rate of 3.3%. The question is, what has driven that growth? And clearly, almost half of that growth has been driven by capital accumulation, roughly 56%. And in addition to that, obviously, labor and human capital have also been important contributors. But once you're able to isolate those effects, we see that beyond the usual drivers of growth, the usual engines, the expansion of broadband has been very important. And when I mean expansion of broadband, I mean not only the increased adoption of broadband that has grown from roughly 1% in 2010 to 66% in 2019, but also the increase in speed, the speed by which we access broadband. So if you isolate the effect of broadband with regards to economic growth, you can see that roughly 10% or 11% of that growth has been driven by adoption, and in addition to the improvements that we see on speed. Having said that, then, if broadband had remained at the levels of adoption and quality of service that existed in 2010, the economic growth would have been roughly $1.3 trillion less than what it actually occurred. So rather than $19.6 trillion, it would have, instead of the $20.9 trillion, it would have been $19.6 trillion. So that's important because that's money that drives back to consumers, and it would be roughly $4,000 annual dollars less for the average American. So clearly, the contribution of broadband in terms of economic effects that trickles down to the average American has been important. The primary impact of broadband in the context of pandemics or major social disruptions such as COVID is that it enhances the economic and social resilience of nations. What do we mean by that is that if we didn't have broadband, the disruption would have been much larger than what it actually was, because businesses couldn't have been operating the same way. We couldn't have been staying at home and continue to do the remote working. The evidence when the pandemic hit was fairly anecdotal. We realized that once we were confined at homes and we could still be working, but we didn't have any way of quantifying what the effect was. There was no data. So when we were confined, and this was in March of 2020, we started studying prior cases, and the only one that we had was the SARS epidemic in 2003 in Southeast Asia. And there we could identify that clearly those countries in Southeast Asia that were more developed in terms of broadband at the time, obviously the quality of broadband was not the same, were able to mitigate part of the disruption that SARS implied. Obviously, a couple of years later, once we started having data in advanced economies and in the United States, we started detecting and verifying and confirming the importance of broadband in mitigating that negative disruption. So in terms of our quantification, and the studies for Network One have proven, is that, for instance, if fixed broadband penetration had been of 90%, which is not unreal because some states in the country do have adoption north of 93%, but primarily in the Northeast, rather than the real 70%. So if it had been 90% on a national average rather than 70%, the economic contraction would have been much less, almost half of it. So as we know, the economic contraction in the year of the pandemic was around 2.2%. Had we had broadband at an adoption by 90%, that contraction would have been 1%, which says that, in conclusion, that states with higher broadband penetration were much better prepared to deal with the social and economic disruption of the pandemic than those that had a lower broadband penetration. So in that sense, the impact of broadband was critical in help us weather that kind of disruption. That's an important question that researchers have been grappling with in terms of what happens when we are reaching levels of adoption that are, let's say, north of 80%. Today, 98% of the American population is covered by broadband. That doesn't mean that 90% adopts it, but roughly adoption is in the order of 85%. So what happens if adoption keeps on growing beyond that 85%? Would we see comparable economic effects had we gone from 20 to 40 or 50%? And we see that economic impact is going to continue as a result of broadband adoption, except that the sources of economic growth are not going to be the same. It's not going to be, there is somewhat of a diminishing return as you move from 80% to 90% of adoption. But where you have an economic impact is because of the increased speed due to the quality of service and the reduction on digital divide. Let me talk a little bit about speed. Clearly, the average speed by which we are accessing broadband is increasing. We are north of 100 megabits per second on an average basis. So speed in and of itself doesn't mean anything from an economic standpoint, except that faster speed means that we can access a larger amount of applications and services than what we had when we were accessing at 5 megabits per second. And research has shown that faster speed has an economic impact. We've looked at Europe, we looked at the United States, and clearly the faster we access broadband, there's more of an economic impact in that domain. The second one, as I mentioned before, is the digital divide reduction. And clearly, if we have 85% of adopting households, what happens to the remaining 15%? And clearly, there is an impact, primarily from a social standpoint, because we're not leaving behind an important portion of the population that, from an access standpoint to either services such as telemedicine or distance learning and the like, now can be incorporated in that universe. And in the context of, obviously, pandemics, as we were talking before, but on a normal day-to-day basis, those are critical, since most of the non-adopting population today resides in rural areas. So there's clearly a social effect. But in addition to that, there is an economic effect. As I said before, it's not going to be as high as if we were to go from 20% adoption to 40% adoption. But we've seen, and research indicates, that even adoption of broadband in rural areas has an important economic effect in terms of development of new businesses, decentralization of existing businesses that are today located in urban centers and the like. When we started, and in fact, our research for Network On started looking at the impact of broadband on remote working in the context of the pandemic, primarily from a perspective of quality of life. And when we look at quality of life, I don't know whether you know or not, but roughly 10% of US workers spend more than 1 hour a day commuting. Going to their offices or their place of work. And 10% of those spend over 2 hours. So clearly, if you don't have to telecommute because you can spend time at home and continue to your normal work routine, but avoid that commuting time, that adds to the quality of life. And that was the first effect that we could actually detect and prove and measure. But then we started looking at a derivative of that reduction in commuting that had to do with the fact that suddenly, either obviously, if you were driving to work, you were contributing to carbon emissions just by virtue of the fact that you were driving your vehicle to work. So we did the analysis at the state and metropolitan area level, and we detected that clearly with a reduction of travel time to work as a result of telecommuting, there was less of a carbon emissions. But we also determined that there was not a one-to-one substitution, meaning that yes, we weren't driving to work, but we were using our cars to go to the grocery store or for some leisure purposes, except that still the net impact was positive in the sense that the amount of time that we spent in cars relative to the one that we spent commuting to work was less. So the net effect was positive in terms of an environmental impact as a result of telecommuting. Interestingly enough, that has become part of the normal environment, given that clearly the new normal implies that at least not for the whole week, but for part of the week, a lot of workers are not commuting to work. So the net environmental impact is clearly on the positive side.